This video has been made possible together with Brilliance, the fun way of learning science, technology, engineering and mathematics. It's the 17th of January 2008 and a Boeing 777-200 from British Airways is on final to runway 27 left at London Heathrow, United Kingdom. The pilots are getting ready for what they believe to be a standard landing after a more than 10-hour-long flight from Beijing, China, but suddenly the engines stop responding to auto-thrust commands. Instead, they're starting to roll back to flight idle. The aircraft pitches up to try to follow the ILS glide slope signal, but without the help of the engines, it's impossible to do so. The pilots are now faced with a scenario that they've never seen before, nor have they been trained for, and they do their absolute best to try to rectify the situation. But the aircraft ends up slamming into the ground 330 meters prior to the threshold of runway 27. Let's together now have a look at the final report and try to figure out why this happened, and also how well the pilots actually dealt with this situation. Stay tuned. British Airways Flight 38 was a scheduled flight from Beijing in China over to London Heathrow in the UK. It is flown by a Boeing 777-236 with two Rolls Royce engines. They are RB211 Trent 895/17 engines. The aircraft was built back in 2001, which makes it about 7 years old at the time of the incident, and it had no recorded snags for this flight. The flight crew consisted of 3 pilots. It was Captain Peter Burkill, which was 43 years old at the time of the incident. He had about 12,700 hours and 8,430 on type. Together with him was Senior First Officer John Coward, who was about 41 years old and had 9,000 hours in total and 7,000 hours on type. And there was also a third pilot called Conor McGuinness. He's 35 years old, has 5,000 hours in total and 1,120 hours on type. And he was there as a cruise pilot, someone who comes in and relieves the other pilots so that they can go and rest during the flight. So it's very normal that we are 3 pilots, or even more if you do very long haul legs. In the cabin, there's 13 cabin crew taking care of the 136 passengers, which is very little for a Boeing 777, which makes this aircraft very light, and that's actually going to have some impact later on. The previous flight was operated from London Heathrow over to Beijing, and when the aircraft landed, the fuel in the tanks was recorded at about minus 20 degrees Celsius. And after the refueling for the return leg to Heathrow, the fuel temperature was still minus 2 degrees. Now, in the pre-flight stage, the pilots had been reviewing their flight plans, and they realized that they were going to fly through some very, very cold air masses on their way over specifically Russia and Scandinavia. So typically the air temperatures at those latitudes tends to be maybe minus 50 to minus 60 degrees centigrade. But on this date, the temperatures was recorded to be as low as minus 70, which was unusually low, but not extremely low. But because of that, the flight planning department of British Airways had actually planned Flight 38 to do a step descent en route in order to get into warmer temperatures. Now you might ask yourself, why is this even an issue? What does it matter that it is cold outside where the aircraft is flying? And that's a fair question, because the aircraft in itself, as in the components of the aircraft, the engines, the body and so on, can take very, very cold temperatures. But the limitation comes to the fuel, okay? Because Jet A1 fuel has a freezing temperature of about minus 44 degrees Celsius. And Jet A fuel, which can also be used, has an even higher freezing temperature of minus 37 degrees. If the fuel is allowed to get down to those temperatures, it will turn into a wax-like substance. That wax-like substance has a much lower kind of fluidity than the fuel, and it can start clogging up things like fuel filters and pumps. And because of that, the Boeing 777 actually has a fuel temperature warning system. So if the fuel temperature comes within 3 degrees of the freezing temperature of the fuel, well then the crew will get a low fuel temperature warning and they need to do something about it. Most of the time you just need to descend in order to get out of this. Now those of you who have been paying attention so far would have noticed that I said that it was going to be about minus 70 degrees centigrade en route. but the fuel freezing temperature is only minus 44, so how does that work? Well, here is where you need to start understanding a little bit about the physics of flight and the temperatures that we're dealing with. So when we fly, we basically deal with two different temperatures. Okay? We have the static air temperature, SAT, which is basically the temperature you get if you are standing in a room holding a thermometer. Okay? Right, just the temperature. Now, if you instead would hold that thermometer up in the air, and then you would start running at Mach 0.02 or faster, you would notice that the temperature actually starts rising. Okay, this has to do with something called ram rise. Okay, and it is a little bit of compressibility in the air. As the air gets compressed at higher speeds, it actually rises a little bit in temperature. And this leads to another temperature, which is called the total air temperature, TAT. And the total air temperature, when we are up at our cruising speed of Mach 0.08, for example, is actually going to be significantly higher. Now, this is not to be confused with the temperature rise you get due to air friction, because the air friction temperature increase will come at much higher speeds. So if you're flying at the speeds of the Concorde or the SR-71 Blackbird, well, then that is going to be what rises the temperature the most. But up until the normal cruising speeds of normal airliners, the ram rise, it's what's causing this. And this means that if we are at a temperature of maybe minus 70 degrees of static air temperature, the total air temperature, which is what's actually affecting the fuel in the tanks, is going to be closer to maybe minus 35, minus 40. And on top of that, the fuel temperature will never be as cold as the temperature outside. Because even though the fuel is stored in the wings and this really, really cold air is flowing over the wings, making a heat transfer from the fuel out to the cold air, inside of the fuel tanks, we have several components that actually heats the fuel. So on the 777, for example, there is hydraulic heat exchangers, 2 in the right-hand wing and 1 in the left-hand wing, which heats the fuel continuously. And because of that, the fuel metering stick, the actual temperature meter, is situated in the left-hand tank, because theoretically that's where the fuel temperature is going to be the lowest. Now, guys, if you are interested in things like thermodynamics, all right, or physics, mathematics, technology, then you should definitely check out the sponsor of this episode, which is Brilliant, right? Brilliant is a fantastic learning tool that makes learning actually both interactive and fun. There are loads of different courses in there, but Scientific Thinking is a course that I really recommend you if you're interested in these things. I have been working on these courses together with my 11-year-old son, Lucas. He loves the little brain puzzles and stuff that are in there. And if you come across something that you don't understand, they will have great ways of explaining how to think about it and to bring you forward in your learning. If you think that this sounds like something you want to try out, then use the link here in the description below or up here, and it will give you a whopping 20% discount on the annual fee of Brilliant. I really recommend you to just click the link, check out if it's something for you, and if it is, get it. Okay, so the next thing we need to discuss when we're talking about temperatures in the fuel is water in the fuel. Basically, it's impossible to keep water completely out of the fuel, right? We do our best. We make sure that there's not a lot of water in the fuel that is being uplifted from the fuel trucks. We also do daily inspections of the aircraft fuel tanks to make sure that there's not much fuel in there. But, you know, air will come into the tanks through these ventilation ducts. It will contain moisture. As the temperature goes down, it's going to start forming water droplets, which will eventually end up inside of the fuel. So a little bit of water in the fuel is absolutely normal, right? And water can exist in the fuel in 3 different states. Either it is dissolved water, right? Dissolved water is when water molecules basically attach to hydrocarbon molecules in the fuel, and in this case, it doesn't really matter, right? It just exists there. However, as the temperature drops in the fuel, you will start to get something called suspended water instead. And this is basically little water droplets that is suspended inside of the fuel, travels around freely in the fuel. Eventually, they are going to start meeting up to each other, crashing into bigger water droplets, and since the water is of a higher density than the fuel, they are going to fall down to the bottom of the tanks and form little puddles. And typically at the lowest points in the tanks, that's where we have our fuel drainage in order to actually find these little puddles of water and get them out of the fuel. The problem can occur when you have a bit of suspended water moving around in the tanks and the fuel temperature drops to, between -5 and the minimum temperature. Because what happens then is that the suspended water will turn into ice crystals. These ice crystals, they will move around, and in that temperature range, between -5 and -20, these ice crystals have a tendency to start sticking together, right? They stick together with each other and they can stick to things like fuel lines, for example, or fuel tanks, right? This is what the scientists refer to as the sticky range. As the temperature go even lower than that, then they're so cold that they don't really stick to anything. They just get sucked with the fuel into the engines and burned up. But ice crystals in the sticky range can be an issue, right? Because they have a tendency to kind of stick to each other and create larger volumes of this slushy, icy substance. And this is going to become important later on. Let's now also talk a little bit about the fuel system on the Boeing 777. So as the fuel is taken from the tanks, it goes through piping, okay? And it first goes through a low pressure pump, and then it goes into something called the fuel oil heat exchanger. The fuel oil heat exchanger serves two purposes. One, it cools down the engine oil, right? And two, it heats up the fuel before it goes into the later components and enter the engine for the combustion chambers. The way that the fuel oil heat exchanger is made is it's basically a cluster of over 1,000 very thin pipes. Now the fuel is pushed through these pipes and the oil is routed around these pipes, thus having a good heat exchange. Okay? The fuel oil heat exchanger is going to become important for this incident, but that's enough technical information for now. The crew made a completely normal pre-flight. They started pushing back, taxiing out, and then took off on their flight towards Heathrow. They had briefed thoroughly about the temperature being an issue. They were well aware of it, and they basically said that throughout the flight they were going to be monitoring the fuel temperature, and if the fuel temperature started to get too low, well then they would descend. They started their climb out to their initial cruise altitude of 35,000 feet, and the initial climb was flown in an autopilot mode called VNAV. Now, when you're in VNAV, basically the aircraft will drive the thrust to full climb thrust, and the aircraft will try to climb as quickly and efficiently as possible. They continued at 35,000 feet until they were about 350 nautical miles north of Moscow. At that point, they were given a step climb to 38,000 feet. Now, this step climb, they didn't use VNAV in, all right? They used another autopilot mode called vertical speed. Now, vertical speed is an autopilot mode that will basically prioritize the vertical speed of the aircraft. So as the pilots put in, for example, 400, 500, 600 feet per minute, well then the aircraft is going to try to achieve that climb rate and just add as much thrust as they need in order to achieve it. And the reason why this is a preferred climb mode during cruise is because it doesn't disturb the passengers. They are hardly going to notice as the engines kind of slowly increase in thrust, and then it's a nice, calm, soft climb up to the new cruising altitude. And they did two of these cruise climbs. So one, as I said, slightly north of Moscow, and then another one up to flight level 400 as they passed over Sweden. The temperature in the tanks never went colder than minus 34 degrees, and that's well above the freezing levels of the fuel. So the crew was happy. The aircraft proceeded normally en route, and they started their descent in towards London Heathrow. As the aircraft now descends towards Heathrow, the temperature outside is starting to warm up, right? So the temperature of the fuel goes up from minus 35 degrees down to minus 22 degrees during the descent. The aircraft flies into a holding pattern over Lambourne at flight level 110 at 11,000 feet, which is completely normal for Heathrow. There's always a lot of traffic coming in there, so you can always expect a few turns in the hold before you start your approach. During the cruise and descent here, the captain is pilot flying, but they have planned for the senior first officer to be doing the landing. And they're going to do something called the monitored approach, which is where one of the pilots flies the approach, which is flown on instruments, and the other pilot, who is the one that's going to actually land, is starting to look out for visual cues at an earlier stage. And as soon as that pilot is happy to take over, he will basically take controls and complete the landing. The reason you want to do this is because it doesn't force one pilot to go from instrument flight to visual flight, right? And it takes away all of the risks associated with this. So this was standard operating procedure for British Airways at the time. The 777 is now vectored for an ILS approach in for runway 27 left in Heathrow. Everything looks completely normal. They coupled with the ILS approach, they're still in autopilot at this point, and everything looks completely normal down to about 1,000 feet above ground. At this point, the aircraft shoots through the clouds, right? They become visual and they transfer the controls over to the first officer. And also, as they come through the clouds, there are a bit of wind changes, right? And when the wind changes, you will also have speed changes. And the autopilot and the auto throttle is engaged, which means that the auto thrust is starting to try to counteract these speed changes. And it does so by increasing the thrust and decreasing it cyclically about 4 times. Okay. Now, on the 4th increase of thrust, the aircraft is about 720 feet above ground. The first officer is looking out, getting ready to disconnect, but now something strange happens. First, the right-hand engine starts suddenly spooling down, right? The thrust levels remain in the same position, but the thrust just comes back gently back to just above idle thrust. It doesn't fail, but it's at idle thrust. 7 seconds later, the same thing happens to the left-hand engine. The first officer starts to notice this because they're starting to see a split in the thrust level position. But he doesn't really understand what it is he's seeing. He's kind of muttering a little bit about it as the aircraft passes 500 feet. Now, the aircraft is completely set up for landing at this point with flaps 30 and basically all of the checklists completed, so the captain calls out stabilized, and the first officer responds with just. And the reason he responds that is because he sees that the speed is now starting to deteriorate. Right? There's still no warnings about any engine failures. The engines are still running, they're producing thrust, but just at a very, very low amount. Now, they had planned to disconnect the autopilot at this point, but it's likely that the first officer is just preoccupied with what it is that he's seeing, so he has not disconnected, which means that the autopilot is now trying to keep the glide slope. The electronic glide slope keeps it at the right path towards the runway, but as the speed is now deteriorating, going lower and lower, the aircraft needs to increase its nose attitude continuously in order to maintain the same amount of lift to maintain the glide slope coming down. At this point, there is recordings of the flight crew starting to discuss why the engines are at idle and trying to troubleshoot, but this is only about 30 seconds prior to impact, so we have very little time at this point. At 115 knots, the first low-speed master caution warning comes up. And the captain responds in a slightly unusual way here. So as he recognizes this low-speed event, he moves over and moves the flap lever from the landing flap position of flap 30 to flaps 25. He also reaches up and switches on the engine start switches, and he starts the APU. Now the attitude of the aircraft is really high, and the stall speed for flaps 30 is about 104 knots with this way. For flaps 25 it's 106 knots, and just about here they get the first stick shaker warning. Right. As the stick shaker comes on, the first officer reacts immediately by lowering the nose attitude, and as it does so, that disconnects the autopilot. The captain realizes what's about to happen now, and he calls in a mayday call on the radio. The aircraft is descending quickly towards the ground here now. The first officer tries to arrest the descent rate by pulling back on the yoke, but the speed is too low and it's too late. The aircraft crashes into the ground with about 1400 feet per minute, producing about 2.9 Gs. And as it does so, the main gear impacts first, it bounces a little bit, and then the right main gear collapses, separates from the aircraft, and as it separates, it goes up and it punches a hole in the right hand side of the aircraft as it flies backward. It punches through about row 30 where there's a passenger seated, and it breaks the leg of the passenger. The left-hand main gear also collapses, but it stays attached to the aircraft, and it actually bends open the fuel tank a little bit on the left-hand side, rupturing the fuel tank. Nose gear collapses, and the aircraft skids off to the right, and it ends up basically just slightly to the right of the threshold markings of runway 27 left. But the aircraft is intact. The crew is stunned immediately, but after a few seconds they initiate, on the command from the captain, a orderly evacuation. All of the evacuation exits works. Some of them can see a little bit of debris outside, so they redirect passengers to other exits. But all in all, this is a very successful evacuation. Okay, everyone survives. There's one serious injury, and that's the passengers that were seated next to the hole in the cabin from the right main gear. But all of the others only have some minor injuries, and this is a complete miracle. The evacuation itself, very smooth. There were, however, reports of some passengers bringing their personal belongings with them, and even one passenger that after the evacuation was complete decided to climb up one of the evacuation slides to retrieve their personal belongings. And this is of course a complete no-no. If you ever end up in an evacuation yourself, just make sure that you and your loved ones in an orderly way progress towards the nearest exit, leave everything behind. You're going to get it later on, and then just get yourself out and follow the directions of either the crew or the fire chief who might be down on the ground. Now, a really thorough investigation takes its start, and it's the Air Accident Investigation Board in the UK together with the NTSB in the US and many other participants that is starting to try to find out how something like this could happen. How come that the engines reacted this way? And what they came up with after many months of testing, including setting up a mock engine and introducing water and checking all of the different involved components, was that the most likely cause of this was that these free-flowing ice crystals had started to mount up inside of the tubing for the engine. And because the flight was flown with very low for the 777 fuel flows, the entire flight all the way down until final, it was really only when the engine started to ask for thrust with flaps 30 hanging out that the fuel flow increased. Okay, and when it increased, it sucked with it all of these ice crystals that had been stuck inside of the tubing, and it ended up inside of the fuel oil heat exchanger. Right? Remember, that's the part that is situated just prior to the engines in order to heat up the fuel and cool down the oil. Now, it was expected that this ice had basically formed into a slush that had temporarily stopped the transfer of fuel through the fuel oil heat exchanger, and that is likely what has caused this. And they've actually found another incident where an American registered 777 had a very similar incident happening at flight level 390, also after cool temperatures in the fuel, where they tried to do a step climb, and when they did so, just after the step climb, the right engine rolled back in a very similar way. It took a few minutes, and then it came back again as the ice probably melted off inside of the fuel oil heat exchanger. So the investigation came to several different safety recommendations. One of these safety recommendations actually made sure that Rolls-Royce had to redesign this part of the fuel system, the fuel oil heat exchanger, so that all the 777s that are using the RB211 Trent 800 engines now have a fuel oil heat exchanger that can actually take this amount of slush, even though that it was shown through some extensive data gathering from more than 175,000 flights that these two flights that suffered this were the only ones that had this combination of circumstances. So how did the crew respond to this incident then? Well, the final report goes into some detail when it comes to this, and if we start looking at the flight crew as a team, the final report basically says that they think that they worked in an effective and professional way given the circumstances. They take into consideration the fact that none of them had been trained for a dual engine run back at such a low altitude. They say that the actions taken by the crew were effective and had a positive effect on the outcome of the incident. And if we look at the aircrew separately, the captain's decision to move the flaps from 30 to 25 was a little bit unorthodox. However, it did extend the glide of the aircraft, and the final report basically said that even though it had very little effect, the aircraft would have touched down inside of the airport boundary even if he hadn't done that. It extended the glide with approximately 50 meters, and that could have had a major impact because at about 40 meters before the touchdown point there was an ILS antenna, and if the aircraft would have hit that antenna as part of the landing, it could have caused even further damage to the aircraft. So that was seen as a positive thing, and it would probably have had even more positive influence on the glide distance if it would have happened at an earlier stage further out. But this brings us to the actions of the first officer. Now, the first officer was the pilot flying during this event, and he was responding in a way that could be expected when faced with a very quickly developing situation like this. The really important thing here is that once he was faced with the stick shaker, even though he was really close to the ground, he did what his training had taught him, which is to push the nose down, to make sure that you offload the wings and keep the aircraft flying. Now, that might sound obvious, but when you are at 400 feet over the ground and you see the runway coming up, I can tell you that the feeling of wanting to keep the nose up in order to kind of stretch the glide to get it down on the runway is going to be almost overwhelming. And the fact that he just focused on what he was trained to do, got the nose down, pitched it down towards the ground, it enabled the aircraft to continue to fly. Had he not done that, if he would have tried to stretch it, it is likely that the aircraft would have stalled and it would have basically touched down in an uncontrolled way, possibly even outside of the airport boundary. So well done. Great to see how the training kind of kicks in even during an extreme situation like this. Once the aircraft had come to a stop on the ground, the captain initially initiated the evacuation command over the VHF frequency, so he called the tower rather than calling on the PA. He then very quickly was made aware of that and made a secondary PA to start evacuation. That's why it took a few seconds for the evacuation to start, but it had no impact on the safety, on the outcome of this incident. The cabin crew did a fantastic job, even though they had not been made aware of this. Obviously, the pilots didn't even know about it until it was about 35-40 seconds prior to touchdown. Once it happened, they reacted according to their training and they facilitated a really effective evacuation of the aircraft. So all in all, a great job under the circumstances by the operating crew. Guys, I hope that you are finding this series about famous incidents and accidents in the aviation history fascinating. And if you are, I hope that I have earned a subscription from you. Now, if you want to subscribe, then click the subscribe button and also highlight the notification bell so you make sure that you get a notification anytime that I send out a new video. And I would also love to hear from you. What do you think? You know, what is the next incident you would like me to cover? Put it into the comments below or contact me in the Mentour Aviation app or the free Discord server. All right, I'm going to link to it up here. You can just click on it, get either the app or the Discord server and contact me. I love hearing from you guys. Until next time, have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.